Okay, ready to dive into something thought-provoking? It might make you rethink how good leadership can sometimes push people towards actions that are ethically blurry. We're talking about situations where a really good leader inspires actions that are great for the company, but maybe not for the ethical rule book.
It's like the road to hell is paved with good intentions.
Exactly. And that's where this fascinating study comes in. It's called Exemplifying Procedural Justice While Strengthening Organizational Identification: The Complex Relationship Between Identity Leadership and Unethical Pro-Organizational Behavior. It's published in the Journal of Applied Social Psychology, and it really digs into how a specific leadership style, it's called identity leadership, can play a role in all of this.
This study really caught my eye because, it challenges that common assumption that good leadership always equals ethical behavior. But in reality, it's way more complicated than that.
So much more nuance. So first things first, what exactly this unethical pro-organizational behavior,
Right.
UPB? Can you give us like some real-world examples of what that looks like?
Sure. So imagine you have a sales team and they're under a ton of pressure to meet their quarterly targets. Right.
Oh, yeah.
So to secure a big deal, a salesperson might be tempted to maybe exaggerate the capabilities of their product, knowing that it might not deliver on all those promises.
Ooh, that's tricky.
Or picture this, a manager who decides to just kind of sweep a minor safety issue under the rug to avoid all that negative publicity, but it could potentially put their employees at risk. Those are some classic examples of UPB, actions that benefit the company in the short term, but they might cross some ethical lines.
Yeah, it's almost like this distorted sense of loyalty where you're so gung-ho about your company that you're willing to bend the rules, even if it means compromising your own sense of right and wrong.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And what's even more interesting is that this type of behavior can actually be encouraged by leadership styles that are usually seen as positive.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's not always about a boss explicitly saying, hey, go do this unethical thing, It's more about subtle cues and indirect influence.
Okay, I'm starting to see how those lines can get so blurry.
For sure.
But what about the consequences of all of this? It can't all be smooth sailing for the company if these unethical actions come to light, right?
Oh, definitely not. The fallout can be really severe, not just for society as a whole, but for the company itself. Think about the Volkswagen emissions scandal. Total textbook case of UPB backfiring.
Big time.
They tried to cheat on emissions tests to protect their image, and it totally blew up in their face.
Yeah.
Billions in fines and just irreparable damage to their reputation.
Ouch, talk about a PR nightmare.
Yeah.
So UPB can be a really slippery slope both for individuals and organizations.
It is, and that's why this research is so important. It sheds light on that whole complex relationship between leadership, organizational culture, and how ethical decisions get made in the workplace.
Right. And speaking of leadership, the study looks at a few different approaches to understand how various leadership styles might contribute to UPB. One that I thought was really interesting is the social learning approach.
Yes.
Is that the whole monkey see, monkey do phenomenon.
Exactly. A 2018 study by Zhang and his colleagues found that if leaders themselves are engaging in UPB, even subtly, their employees are more likely to follow suit. It sets a precedent and sends a message that this kind of behavior isn't just acceptable, but almost expected.
So leading by example.
Right.
But not in a good way.
Exactly.
It's a pretty dangerous precedent to set. And then there's this other approach, the social exchange approach. This one's grounded in this idea of reciprocity. It's like you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours, but with ethical consequences.
Yeah.
So if a leader is really supportive, empowers, their team gives them a lot of autonomy. Employees might feel obligated to return the favor by doing whatever it takes to help the company, even if it means bending the rules a little bit.
Exactly. A 2021 study by Bryant and Merritt looked into this and found some pretty compelling evidence for this social exchange effect.
Okay, so it's like repaying a kindness, but with potentially shady consequences.
Yeah.
The study also mentions the social identity approach, which has to do with how strongly you identify with your company, right?
That's it.
Okay.
The idea is that the more you see yourself as part of that in-group, the more likely you are to protect and promote that group, even if it means engaging in UPB. A 2016 study by Chen and colleagues really explored this.
It's like those diehard sports fans who would do anything for their team, even get into a brawl. So with all these different approaches in mind, the study really zeroes in on this concept of identity leadership. What makes this leadership style stand out, and why is it so important when we're talking about all this UPB stuff?
Identity leadership is all about leaders embodying the values and aspirations of their team. They're not just barking orders,
Yeah.
They're seen as living examples. They champion the group's goals, and that can be incredibly inspiring and motivating for their employees.
Sounds pretty positive so far.
Yeah.
So where does the potential for unethical behavior come in?
That's where things get really interesting. The study says that identity leadership can be a double-edged sword. While it can be a powerful force for good, it also has a darker side.
A darker side. It all depends on the specific values and norms that the leader embodies.
So a double-edged sword, huh?
Exactly. Imagine an identity leader who's all about winning, no matter the cost, even if it means cutting corners ethically. Their employees, fueled by their leader's example and that strong sense of belonging to the group.
They might be more likely to follow suit and engage in UPB.
So like a charismatic leader who's all about winning at all costs could unintentionally be setting the stage for some pretty serious ethical issues.
Precisely. That's why the study really emphasizes the importance of context. Identity leadership in itself isn't good or bad. It's the values and behaviors that it promotes that determine its ethical implications.
Okay, that makes sense. But how can you tell if identity leadership is pushing people toward ethical or unethical behavior? How can you tell the difference?
That's where procedural justice comes into play.
Procedural justice.
It's about how fair and transparent decision-making processes are within an organization.
So if employees feel like they're being treated fairly and decisions are made openly and honestly, could that help mitigate the risk of UPB, even with a really strong identity leader at the helm?
That's the hypothesis, and the study found some really compelling evidence to support it. They actually uncovered this fascinating interaction effect between identity leadership and procedural justice.
Interaction effect. Okay, you're going to have to break that down for me.
Sure.
I'm not a statistician.
Think of it like baking a cake. You need the right ingredients in the right proportions for it to turn out right. So identity leadership is like the sugar, and procedural justice is like the baking powder. On their own. They might not do much, but when you combine them, they can either make that cake rise beautifully or cause it to totally collapse.
Okay, now you're speaking my language. So the impact of identity leadership on whether people engage in UPB really depends on the level of procedural justice in the workplace.
You got it. If employees experience high procedural justice, meaning they see fairness and transparency in how decisions are made, they are less likely to engage in UPB, even when led by a strong identity leader.
So procedural justice is like a safety net. That prevents people from falling into unethical behavior, even when their leader might be tempted to push the boundaries.
That's a great way to put it. It's like that sense of fairness acts as a buffer. But here's the catch. When procedural justice is low, the opposite can happen.
Oh, no, wait. So if employees feel like they're being treated unfairly, and then they see their identity leader, their role model, engaging in UPB, they're even more likely to jump on that bandwagon.
You got it. It's like a recipe for disaster.
Oh, no.
A strong, charismatic leader coupled with a sense of injustice in the workplace can actually increase the likelihood of unethical behavior.
Wow, that's a sobering thought. So it seems like procedural justice plays a huge role in shaping how identity leadership ultimately influences ethical behavior.
Absolutely. It's not just about having a charismatic leader. It's about creating a workplace culture where fairness and transparency are woven into how things are done.
That's a lot to process, but I'm already seeing how this research has some major implications for leaders' organizations.
Oh, it does.
Speaking of this research, I think it's time to dig a little deeper into how they investigated these complex relationships. They did 3 separate studies, right?
They did.
I'd love to hear more about those studies. Where do we start?
Well, the first study was all about perceptions. They wanted to see how employers' perceptions of their supervisors as identity leaders might influence their willingness to engage in UPB. So they actually manipulated those perceptions.
Hold on, how do you manipulate someone's perception of their boss?
It was pretty clever. They had a group of employees do a writing exercise. Some of them were asked to write about all the aspects of their supervisor that made them seem like a true identity leader, a real representative of their team.
So focusing on the positive leadership equalities.
Exactly.
What about the other group?
The other group had to do the opposite. They had to focus on the things about their supervisor that made them seem less connected to the team, almost like an outsider.
So they were priming one group to see their boss as an identity leader, and the other group to see them as well. Not so much of an identity leader.
And then after this writing exercise, all the participants answered a questionnaire about their work experiences. Things like their willingness to engage in UPB, how strongly they identified with their organization, and they rated their supervisors on identity leadership and procedural justice.
So the big question is, did priming people to see their boss as an identity leader actually lead them to be more willing to engage in UPB.
That's where things get really interesting, just thinking about your supervisor as an identity leader didn't directly lead to higher UPB intentions overall, but it did have a significant effect when you factored in procedural justice.
Okay, procedural justice is back in the mix. Remind me how that plays into all of this.
Remember our cake analogy?
Yeah, the sugar and the baking powder.
Well, procedural justice is like that baking powder. It interacts with identity leadership. The study found that those who had very low levels of procedural justice,
So they felt like they weren't being treated fairly at work.
exactly, they were much more likely to report higher UPB intentions if they'd been primed to view their supervisor as a strong identity leader.
So if you feel like you're getting a raw deal at work and you see your leader who you really identify with engaging in UPB, that's a recipe for trouble.
Exactly. But for those who felt like they were being treated fairly,
So high procedural justice.
thinking about their supervisor as an identity leader didn't really have a noticeable impact on their UPB intentions.
So it's like fairness acts as a shield against those potentially unethical influences.
That's a great way to put it. It really highlights how vital it is to create a fair and just work environment, especially when you have those strong, influential leaders. But that was just the first study. They wanted to dig deeper. So in the second study, they brought in a much larger group of participants, and this time they didn't manipulate anything.
So no more perception priming exercises.
Nope. This time they just measured existing levels of identity leadership, procedural justice, organizational identification, and UPB intentions.
Using surveys.
Exactly. They wanted to see how all these variables were related to each other in a real-world setting without any interference.
That's what they find.
They found that interaction effect between identity leadership and procedural justice again. But this time, something different happened when procedural justice was high. The link between identity leadership and UPB intentions actually became negative.
Wait, negative.
Yeah.
So in a fair and just workplace, being led by a strong identity leader actually led to lower levels of UPB intentions.
That's what they found. It really reinforces this idea that when the environment is perceived as fair and transparent, even a leader who might be prone to pushing boundaries isn't going to sway people towards unethical behavior.
Fascinating. So both studies are pointing to procedural justice as a key factor in determining whether identity leadership encourages or discourages UPB.
That's a big one.
What about the third study? Did they mix things up again?
They did. This time, they kept the same basic design as the second study measuring existing variables, but they added in a measure of what's called socially desirable responding.
So basically, they wanted to make sure people weren't just giving answers they thought the researchers wanted to hear.
Exactly. They wanted to see if people were being honest about their willingness to engage in UPB, even if it wasn't the most socially acceptable thing to admit.
Clever. Did this extra measure change anything? Were the results different?
The main findings held strong. They once again found that crucial interaction effect between identity leadership and procedural justice. But this time, they observed both effects we saw in the previous studies.
Both effects.
Yep. They found that identity leadership was associated with lower UPB intentions when procedural justice was high, but higher UPB intentions when procedural justice was very low.
So it's like these two forces, the leader's influence and the perceived fairness of the workplace, they're constantly battling it out. And which one wins depends on which force is stronger.
But all three studies also found another really fascinating pathway through which identity leadership can influence unethical behavior.
Really? Tell me more.
It all comes down to organizational identification. That sense of belonging, feeling deeply connected to your company, almost like it's an extension of yourself.
Right. We touched on that earlier with the whole social identity approach.
Exactly.
The more you identify with your organization, the more likely you are to protect it, even if it means bending the rules.
Right. The study suggests that identity leadership can actually strengthen that organizational identification, which in turn can lead to increased intentions to engage in UPB.
It's like dominoes falling, one thing leads to another.
Think of it this way. An identity leader comes in, inspires the troops, gets everyone feeling like they're part of something bigger than themselves.
Everyone's super pumped, all in, totally drinking the company Kool-Aid.
And in that state of heightened organizational identification, they might be more willing to do things they wouldn't normally do, like engage in UPB, all in the name of the company's success.
So it's not just about the leader directly modeling unethical behavior. It's about them cultivating this whole culture where people are so devoted to the organization that they might cross ethical lines without even realizing it.
It's a subtle but powerful dynamic.
That makes sense. But in that first study, the one with the writing exercise, The connection between organizational identification and UPB wasn't as strong.
Yeah.
What happened there?
You've got a sharp eye. You're right. The first study didn't show a statistically significant relationship between organizational identification and UPB intentions.
So what's the deal? Was there like a flaw in the study design?
Not necessarily. Remember, they manipulated perceptions of identity leadership. In that first study, they asked people to focus on specific aspects of their supervisor.
The whole identity leader versus not so much an identity leader thing.
Exactly. Well, it's possible that this manipulation might have unintentionally increased both identity leadership and organizational identification for the people in the identity leader group.
So their perception of their supervisor as a strong leader spilled over into their feelings about the company as a whole.
Exactly. And that might have created a ceiling effect for organizational identification, making it harder to see any additional effect on UPB.
Okay, so the results of that first study, in terms of organizational identification, should be taken with a grain of salt.
Yeah.
But the other two studies, which measured existing levels of identity leadership and organizational identification without any manipulation, found a clear link between organizational identification and UPB.
Right. So taking all the studies together, the evidence suggests that identity leadership can indirectly promote UPB by increasing people's identification with their organization.
Wow, this is really making me question everything I thought I knew about leadership and ethics.
It's eye-opening, isn't it?
It is, but let's zoom out for a moment and consider the bigger picture. What are the practical implications of this research? What does it all mean for leaders and organizations? What's the takeaway here?
Well, for starters, it really blows up this idea that just being a good leader automatically means you're going to have an ethical workplace.
Right. It's not enough to just be charismatic and inspiring. Leaders really need to be aware of the values and behaviors they're promoting, both directly and indirectly.
Think about the messages you send through your actions, through the decisions you make, through the culture you create.
Because all of that can have a ripple effect on how your employees approach ethical dilemmas.
Exactly. And this research really highlights how important procedural justice is.
Yeah, creating that environment where people feel like they're being treated fairly, where decisions are transparent.
It can really go a long way in preventing UPB.
Even when you have a leader who might be tempted to push those ethical boundaries, that sense of fairness can act as a safeguard.
That's a powerful insight.
So for leaders who are listening to this, what can they actually do? How can they take this research and create a more ethical workplace, especially if they identify as identity leaders?
Well, it's not just about having a code of conduct hanging on the wall.
It's got to be more than just words on a page, right?
Exactly. It's about actively fostering a culture of ethical behavior.
Okay, that sounds good in theory, but how do they actually put that into practice? What are some concrete steps they could take?
First and foremost, lead by example.
Walk the walk. Don't just talk the talk.
Precisely. Leaders need to consistently demonstrate ethical behavior in their own actions and decisions. This sends a powerful message to their employees that ethics really matter.
So don't just preach about doing the right thing.
Yeah.
Actually do it yourself.
Be transparent about how and why you make decisions. Explain your rationales. Involve your team. Get their input, address concerns openly and honestly.
That makes a lot of sense when people feel like they're in the loop, that they're being heard. It builds trust, and that can create a sense of fairness.
And as we've seen, fairness is crucial for preventing UPB.
But isn't there a danger in being too transparent? Could that slow things down, stifle innovation, create unnecessary bureaucracy?
It's a balancing act, for sure. You don't have to share every single detail of every decision.
Yeah.
But when it comes to matters that have ethical implications, transparency is key.
So focus on the areas where those ethical lines could get blurry.
Right. And remember, procedural justice isn't just about being fair. It's also about being perceived as fair.
So even if a leader genuinely believes they're doing the right thing, if their team doesn't see it that way, it can still lead to problems.
That's why communication is so crucial. Leaders need to constantly be communicating with their teams, explaining their reasoning, being open to feedback.
It's all about creating that open dialogue, that two-way street where everyone feels heard and respected.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
I'm starting to see how this research goes beyond just a theoretical exercise.
Oh, for sure.
It has real-world implications for how we think about leadership and the ethical choices we make every day.
Absolutely. It challenges us to go deeper, to move past these simplistic assumptions and grapple with the complex factors that influence ethical behavior in the workplace.
It's a reminder that even the best leaders, those with the purest intentions, can unintentionally contribute to unethical behavior, and that building a truly ethical culture requires a conscious effort from everyone in the organization. It's an ongoing journey, not a destination.
Exactly. We need to constantly be looking in the mirror, questioning our actions, making sure we're living up to the values we espouse.
And we need to be willing to have those difficult conversations.
Yes.
To challenge each other when we see something that doesn't sit right.
Because at the end of the day, creating a more ethical world starts with each of us making the commitment to do the right thing, even when it's hard.
Well said. I think we've officially reached the bottom of this deep dive. I hope you've surfaced with some new insights and a renewed commitment to ethical leadership.
And remember, if you want to explore this topic further, the full paper is called Exemplifying Procedural Justice While Strengthening Organizational Identification: The Complex Relationship Between Identity Leadership and Unethical Pro-Organizational Behavior. It was published in the Journal of Applied Social Psychology.
So there you have it, folks. All the info you need to do your own deep dive into this fascinating subject.
And until next time, keep those minds curious and those conversations flowing.
Happy diving, everyone.